The dust is rising in the south, and the world is watching in disbelief. 10,000 boots are hitting the ground where silence used to reign. A shadow has fallen over the Rio Grande that no one predicted. The United States government is watching the monitors with bated breath. What was once a porous line in the sand has turned into a fortress of steel. Mexico has just made a move that changes the geopolitical chessboard forever. Is this an act of cooperation, or a desperate bid for survival? The highways are choked with military convoys heading north. You need to understand the scale of what is happening right now. This isn't just a deployment. It is a historic shift in power. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story is evolving fast. Comment below. Do you think this troop surge will actually stop the crisis? We are diving deep into the heart of the border chaos today. Prepare yourself for the truth behind the headlines. Let's go. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the first reports began to filter into the Situation Room in Washington, carrying with them the weight of a geopolitical earthquake that few had anticipated with such precision or speed. It wasn't just a handful of trucks or a ceremonial changing of the guard, but a veritable river of iron and camouflage flowing steadily northward along the dusty highways of Mexico. A mobilization so vast it seemed to vibrate the very ground of the continent. American satellites and drone surveillance feeds were suddenly flooded with imagery that looked less like a border enforcement operation and more like a full-scale military invasion preparation, sparking a wave of confusion and urgent phone calls across the highest levels of the Pentagon and the Department of Homeland Security. 10,000 troops? A number that rolls off the tongue easily but represents a logistical leviathan, were being pulled from the depths of Mexico's interior, from the humid coasts of Veracruz and the bustling streets of the capital, and thrust directly into the arid, unforgiving landscape of the northern frontier. This was the direct, visceral consequence of a high-stakes diplomatic poker game that had reached its climax only 48 hours prior, a game where the chips were the economic livelihoods of millions and the bluff was a crippling 25% tariff. President Claudia Sheinbaum, facing the barrel of an economic gun loaded by the administration in Washington, had made a decision that would define her presidency in its infancy. Choosing to militarize the border rather than watch the peso crumble into dust, the atmosphere in Ciudad Juarez transformed overnight, shifting from the chaotic bustle of a border town into the rigid, disciplined tension of an occupied zone, where the hum of commerce was replaced by the roar of armored personnel carriers. Locals watched from behind curtained windows as the National Guard, distinct in their white-gray uniforms, set up checkpoints on roads that had been unpolished for decades, their faces masked and their rifles held at the ready. This was Operation Northern Shield in all its terrified glory, a frantic attempt to seal a 2,000-mile wound with human bodies, before the economic sanctions could bleed the Mexican economy dry. The tariff guillotine, as the Mexican press had dubbed the threat from the north, had hung over the country like a storm cloud, promising to slash the profitability of the automotive and agricultural sectors that form the backbone of the nation's trade. In the boardrooms of Monterrey and the government palaces of Mexico City, the panic had been palpable, a cold sweat that transcended political party lines and united the elite in a singular, desperate objective: appease the North. But for the soldiers now standing in the blistering sun of the Sonoran Desert, high politics meant nothing compared to the gritty, dangerous reality of their new orders, which effectively turned them into the final line of defense for American sovereignty. They were tasked not just with stopping the desperate families fleeing poverty in Central America, but with the far more lethal mission of intercepting the fentanyl shipments that the U.S. president had declared an act of war. The cartels, those shadow empires that had long operated with impunity in these borderlands, were suddenly finding their smuggling routes, choked by a density of military force they had not encountered in years. Intelligence reports suggested that the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels were momentarily stunned, pulling back their scouts and halcones to assess this new variable. A pause in the violence that felt heavy with the threat of future retaliation. Meanwhile, on the American side of the line, in places like El Paso and San Diego, the reaction was a complex mixture of relief, skepticism, and profound surprise at the sheer speed of the Mexican response. Border Patrol agents, accustomed to being overwhelmed and under-resourced, looked across the dividing line to see a mirror image of enforcement. A wall of green and gray that seemed to stretch endlessly into the heat haze. It was a surreal tableau, a moment where the sovereignty of two nations seemed to blur into a single, militarized zone of exclusion, enforced by the fear of economic collapse on one side and the fear of demographic change on the other. The deployment was focused heavily on the key transit points: Tijuana, the chaotic gateway to California; Ciudad Juarez, the industrial heart connecting to Texas; and Matamoros, the humid Gulf crossing effectively plugging the main arteries of migration. In Tijuana, the famous boardwalk near the beach, where the rusty slats of the border wall dip into the Pacific Ocean, became a staging ground for platoons of soldiers who marched in formation, a visual message clearly intended for the cameras on the other side. Migrant shelters, already bursting at the seams with Haitians, Venezuelans, and Hondurans, buzzed with rumor and fear. the grapevine spreading the word that the northern door had been slammed shut and locked with a military key. Desperation began to curdle into anger among those who had traveled thousands of miles, only to find that the final step of their journey was now blocked not by American harshness, but by Mexican soldiers acting as the extended arm of U.S. policy. There were reports of scuffles of tear gas deployed in remote canyons where groups tried to probe the new defenses, testing the resolve of the young National Guard recruits who looked nervous behind their riot shields. This was the human cost of the deal, the invisible friction generated when geopolitical agreements made in air-conditioned offices grind against the flesh and bone of the world's most vulnerable populations. Yet for the White House, this was a victory, a tangible proof that pressure worked, that the threat of tariffs was a lever long enough to move the entire Mexican military apparatus. The stunned reaction in Washington was less about the fact of the deployment and more about the compliance. The realization that Mexico had effectively ceded control of its military strategy to satisfy American domestic demands. But military experts warned that this was a fragile, unsustainable posture. Keeping 10,000 troops on high alert in the desert is a logistical nightmare that drains resources from the rest of the country. Mexico is a nation already bleeding from internal wounds, with violence flaring in states like Chiapas and Michoacán, areas that were now being stripped of their security forces to feed the hunger of the northern border. Critics in Mexico City screamed that the president was leaving the sheep unguarded to protect the neighbor's fence, a sentiment that resonated in the rural towns now left vulnerable to the whims of local crime bosses. The question of fentanyl, the toxic powder that drove much of this diplomatic fury, remained the dark heart of the operation, a needle in a haystack that 10,000 troops might still fail to find. Soldiers were seen tearing apart commercial trucks, ripping open upholstery, and drilling into fruit shipments, a frantic search for the precursor chemicals and finished pills that were killing tens of thousands of Americans annually. It was a display of force, certainly, but was it a display of effectiveness, or merely a theater of security designed to produce the right metrics for the next diplomatic summit? The U.S. administration had demanded results, and Mexico had delivered activity, a massive, undeniable surge of motion and manpower that looked good on a briefing slide but had yet to prove its long-term worth. As night fell over the Rio Grande Valley, the landscape was illuminated not just by the moon but by the tactical lights of patrols on both banks, a dual-layered surveillance state that turned the river into a no-man's-land. The coyotes, the human smugglers who profit from misery, were already adapting, shifting their routes deeper into the inhospitable wilderness, driving migrants into the most dangerous waterless stretches of the desert to bypass the troop concentrations. This creates a deadly paradox. The more secure the border becomes through military presence, the higher the death toll rises in the remote corridors where desperate people are forced to go. We are witnessing the balloon effect in real time, squeezing the flow in the cities only to see it bulge out in the deadly battle. A tragic cycle that has defined border enforcement for decades, but never before has the squeeze been applied with such sudden, overwhelming force by the Mexican side. A shift that fundamentally alters the psychological calculus of every migrant heading north. The message is no longer, if you can make it to the border, you have a chance. It is now the border is a garrison, and you are walking into a trap set by two nations. Back in Washington, the political spin machine was in overdrive, framing the deployment as a direct result of strong leadership and a validation of the hardline approach to trade and security. The threat of tariffs had been paused for now, a suspended sentence that kept the Mexican government in a state of perpetual anxiety, knowing that the troops could not leave without risking the return of the economic axe. This creates a permanent state of emergency, a forever deployment that risks demoralizing the Mexican military and exhausting the patience of the border communities that now live under de facto martial law. Business owners in border cities complained of slowing trade, of the oppressive atmosphere that frightened away tourists and investors, creating a localized recession even as the national economy was spared. The tariff hit. The irony was bitter. To save the economy from tariffs, the government had imposed a military reality that strangled the vibrant cross-border culture that made these regions thrive. And what of the cartels? They are organizations built on adaptability. Vast corporations of crime that have survived every previous war on drugs declared by presidents on either side of the line. Intelligence intercepts suggested they were simply waiting, biding their time, knowing that soldiers eventually get tired, that budgets run dry, and that political will is a fickle resource that shifts with the wind. They know that 10,000 troops cannot watch every inch of a 2,000-mile frontier forever, and they are masters of finding the cracks in the armor, the blind spots in the surveillance grid. The stunned silence of the U.S. might soon be replaced by the frustration of reality, as the flow of drugs finds new, ingenious vector drones, tunnels, submarines, or simply corruption of the very forces sent to stop them. Already, rumors of bribery were circulating, whispers that the silver or lead plata o plomo choice was being offered to the commanders of the new detachments, a corruption test that is as old as the border itself. If the Mexican military becomes compromised, if the shield turns out to be made of paper, the diplomatic fallout will be catastrophic. potentially leading to the very tariffs that this whole operation was designed to avoid. The stakes could not be higher. This is a gamble with the stability of two nations, played out on a strip of land that has seen too much history and too little peace. President Sheinbaum has bought herself a month, perhaps two, of breathing room, but the clock is ticking loudly in the background, a countdown to the next crisis. The U.S. is watching, the cartels are watching, and the migrants, huddled in the cold desert night, are watching, all waiting to see if this wall of flesh will hold, or if it will crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The images of soldiers standing guard against the backdrop of the American dream are stark, a visual definition of the modern era where migration and security have collided with explosive force. Every truck that rumbles past a checkpoint is a reminder of the fragility of the global order, of how quickly the rules can change when a superpower decides to flex its economic muscle. This is not just a story about troops. It is a story about sovereignty in the 21st century, about the limits of what a nation can be forced to do by its neighbor. Mexico has deployed its sons and daughters to the border not to defend against an invasion, but to stop an exodus, a twisting of the traditional role of the military that makes many uneasy. The soldiers themselves, young men and women from Oaxacan villages in Mexico City, Burrios, stand with their rifles, looking north at the land of opportunity that they are now paid to protect from the outside. There is a profound melancholy in that image, a realization of the deep inequalities that drive the crisis, inequalities that no amount of troops or tariffs can truly solve. As the sun sets on the first week of this massive operation, the border remains a tense, vibrating wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The world is stunned, yes, but perhaps we should not be. Perhaps this is simply the inevitable conclusion of decades of failed policy and ignored warnings. The deployment of 10,000 troops is a scream for attention, a physical manifestation of a system that has broken down completely. And as the night deepens, the only sound is the wind howling through the mesquite brush and the distant rumble of a patrol vehicle, prowling the line that divides the world. We are left with a question. What happens next when the shock wears off and the troops are still there? Will this be the new normal? A permanent militarization of the North American continent? Only time will tell. But for now, the border is a fortress, and the eyes of the world are locked on the 10,000 soldiers standing in the dust.